Good day, students and learners. Welcome to Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. In this session, we'll be looking at the relationships between total utility, average utility, and marginal utility. Previously, we've defined total utility to be the total amount of satisfaction that is derived from the consumption of a given quantity of commodity at a given point in time. We have defined average utility as total utility divided by the quantity consumed, and we have defined marginal utility as the additional satisfaction or utility that is derived for the consumption or from the consumption of extra or additional units of the commodity. We will be using a graphical representation to explain the relationships between these three utility functions. Now, these functions of average utility, total utility, and marginal utility are typical. The shapes are typical of these functions. The total utility, represented by the blue line or the blue graph, typically rises and falls. Average utility also typically rises and then falls. And marginal utility is typically downward sloping. So what is the relationship? We have previously seen some of the relationships that exist between marginal utility and total utility. So we'll expand a bit on what we already know. What we knew is that marginal utility is positive up to a point, becomes zero, and then runs into negative. And that when it is positive or greater than zero, our total utility is correspondingly rising. At the point when it is zero is where our total utility is at the highest. So the relationships between total utility, average utility, and marginal utility can be explained using this graph. Now, here we have utility, and here we have quantity. The blue curve represents total utility, TU, utility. The red curve represents average utility, And the yellow curve represents marginal utility. And this is further made easy by this key here, which shows that the blue is total utility, the red average utility, and the yellow marginal utility. And here we are trying to explore the relationships between total utility, average utility, and marginal utility. So, previously we had seen some relationship or some interplay between marginal utility and total utility, where we saw that when marginal utility is positive, total utility is rising. And when it is zero, total utility is at its highest. And when it becomes negative, total utility begins to fall. We can also see, in addition to that, when when average utility is highest, it is equal to marginal utility. As we can see here, marginal utility is typically downward sloping. It's typically downward sloping from left to right, like a demand curve. And later on, we'll see this relationship. Average utility rises, gets to a peak, just like the total utility, and then falls. But at that peak, it is always equal to marginal utility. And total utility rises, gets to a peak, and begins to fall. And at its peak, it is when marginal utility is equal to zero. So this is also very clear if we go to a schedule. A schedule can also show this. Sorry. That schedule. So we saw that as our total utility was increasing, it got to a peak at 35. Our average utility also got to a peak, or is also at a peak at 9.5. Sorry, at 10. Average utility is at 10, and marginal utility is highest also at 10. So this schedule can also show those relationships, which we represented on a graph. So we said that, firstly, when marginal utility is positive, from 10 up until 1, it is positive, even up to until 0 is positive, and we see that our total utility for that length is increasing from 10 to 19 through to 35. And when it's negative, it begins to fall. So total utility fell from 35 to 34 and then to 31. We also saw that when it is when marginal utility is 0, total utility is at its highest. So the relationships between the utility concepts of TU, AU, and MU can be explained in a graph and also in a schedule, or are clearly depicted in a graph and in a schedule as well. However, let me finally point out that the highest point of the total utility curve is referred to as the point of satiety, or the point of saturation. This is where satisfaction is highest, and further consumption of that commodity will begin to lead to a fall in satisfaction. In other words, if additional units of that commodity is consumed, total utility will decline and marginal utility will also become negative. In other words, we get to dissatisfaction. Now, how does a consumer achieve highest satisfaction or utility maximization? Whether it's highest satisfaction or utility maximization, it can also be referred to as at what point does a consumer achieve equilibrium. So we are going to look at two cases, for a single commodity and then for two commodities. For ease of analysis, we use two commodities in economics to explain a hypothesis. But let's first look at the case of a single commodity. So for a single commodity, a consumer achieves equilibrium. Equilibrium means maximum satisfaction or maximum utility or highest satisfaction. And it is at the point where the marginal utility of that product is equal to the price of the product. Utility is maximized when the marginal utility of consuming that product is equal to the price of the product. Because this is explained by the fact that the consumer is willing to pay more and more for the product up until when it gets to the price, or rather the market price of the product. So if the price of the product is less than the market price, the consumer typically will buy more and more of the product. When the price of the product is beyond the market price, the consumer is no longer likely to consume more of the product. Therefore, it is said that that consumer has achieved equilibrium or has achieved maximum satisfaction. And this is mathematically represented as marginal utility of a product X, for example, is equal to the price of that product X. The second case is for two commodities. Now, where you have two or more commodities, the consumer will have to allocate his income or his funds or his resources to different combinations of the different products. Therefore, the consumer, for a two commodity case, the consumer will achieve equilibrium when the marginal utility of the first product, say product A, divided by the price of that product is equal to the marginal product of the second product, say B, divided by the price of the product. So, where we have apples and bananas, for example, this consumer, in the case of these two commodities, will be at equilibrium or will have achieved utility maximization, where the marginal utility of apples divided by the price of apples is equal to the marginal utility of bananas divided by the price of banana. Where you have more than one product, it continues like that. So if we had another product, say it's a 3-product scenario, then we would have this also being equal to the marginal utility of another product, say, what now? A over the price of A equal to another product, a 4th product, marginal utility of B over the price of B. Now, this relation is very, very important when we begin to look at consumer equilibrium in details, especially when we consider the cardinal approach, where utility is said to be measurable in concrete terms, utils. So, we have come to the end of this session, where we have talked about the relationships between the concepts of total utility, average utility, and marginal utility, as explained in a graph and also by a schedule. And we have also seen what it means when we talk about utility maximization, or where the consumer has achieved highest equilibrium or has achieved highest satisfaction. And we looked at a single commodity case and a 2 or more commodity case.
Acing your WAEC and NECO examinations has been made easy by the Lagos State Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education with the Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO Candidates television program. Join seasoned teachers as they take you through these core subjects, targeting the exact syllabus of WAEC and NECO. Watch Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates through these social media platforms to access more educational content and give their feedback. Eko Learners Support for WAEC and NECO candidates. Pass your examinations with flying colors.
So thank you for listening. If you have any feedback, observations, or suggestions, you can reach us on our social media handles that will be displayed on the screen.